Good day, this is Life to Tape. We are continuing our story of Vicki Barr, Flight Stewardess, The Clue of the Golden Coin. We're starting on Chapter 7, Ubar City. New York had been icy cold and covered with a blanket of snow. Now as Captain March backed his big airplane into the landing pattern over Tampa, it was as though Vicki were on some kind of futuristic spaceship coming down into a completely different world. Funny, she thought. This morning it was winter, this afternoon it was summer. When the ship rolled to a standstill in front of the unloading gate and the big door was swung open, Vicki breathed a deep sigh of thick, sweet-scented air and sighed contentedly. Golly, she thought, I'm falling in love with Florida. Me, a girl from Illinois. She quickly went through the routine of checking in at the flight's end, and then once more found herself face to face with the problem of what to do about Joey. She knew that she had to talk with him, but again she decided against going to the warehouse to see him. It would be better to get his address from personnel and call him at his boarding house. Just as she was making this decision, she heard a cheerful, familiar voice. Hi there, Miss Vicki. Joey's eager face certainly didn't look like that of a suspected criminal. I saw your plane come in, and I asked the boss for a few minutes off to come over and say hello. You're just the person I wanted to see, Joey, Vicki told him. Come over to the snack bar and I'll buy you a Coke. Nothing doing, the boy grinned. I'll come with you, but the Coke's on me. Vicki led the way to one of the booths, and when they had ordered, she said seriously, Look here, Joey, you may be in trouble. Joey frowned, then his face brightened in his infectious grin. If you mean about that flashlight they found the night of the gold shipment disappeared. If you mean about that flashlight they found the night the gold shipment was stolen, forget it. Forget it? Sure, it was my flashlight, all right. But either it was stolen from my locker, or I left it around and somebody picked it up. The FBI men squeezed me about it, but I proved that I couldn't have been anywhere near the airfield that night. I roomed with a fellow by the name of Pete Sanders. He works in the terminal check room. Well, that particular night, Thursday, I met Pete after work, and we ate supper at Cece's Italian restaurant down by the docks. Then we went to a movie and got home a little after 12. I told all this to the FBI man, and Pete told him too. What I was thinking about, Vicki said, was that job offer that man made you in the same afternoon. The man who promised you $100 to do a job for him and offered to give you $25 of it in advance. Joey's eyes widened. How in the world did you know about that, Miss Vicki? I haven't mentioned it to a soul, not even Pete. It just so happened, Joey, that I was sitting in the next booth, this very one we're in now, and I couldn't help overhearing. All Joey could say was an astonished gee. Have you seen him again, Mr. Duke? Wasn't that his name? Joey finally found his voice. Gosh, no. I figured he was nutty or something, offering me all that money out of the clear sky. I couldn't have touched it for anything. It sounded either crazy or crooked, and I didn't want any part of it. Vicki breathed a deep sigh of genuine relief. She'd been pretty sure that Joey wouldn't get himself mixed up in something wrong. If I were you, Joey, Vicki said, I'd go tell Mr. Quayle, the FBI investigator, and tell him about your conversation with Mr. Duke. Gee, Vicki, Joey was so startled by the suggestion that he neglected to add the usual miss, which he automatically put in front of her name. Do you think Mr. Duke might have something to do with the stolen gold? Vicki thought for a swift moment. Her vague, uninformed suspicions wouldn't make any sense to the boy. She said, Not necessarily, but some mighty particular things have been going around this airport, and even though you've proved that you weren't in the warehouse Thursday night, it was your flashlight the prowler dropped, and up to now you're the only person who has come under suspicion. I think you ought to go to Mr. Quayle, if for no other reason than to show that you want to do everything you can to help him. Besides, sometimes little odd, unrelated facts can be the key that opens up the whole mystery. I'm not saying this is one, she added hastily, but I'm saying that it could be. Gee, Joey said again. If you think I should, I'll certainly do it. And do it right now, Vicki advised, before you report back to work. Joey looked anxiously at the clock over the lunch counter. I'm supposed to be back on the job in 5 minutes. Van's a good guy, but he'll get sore when people are late. Just tell him the FBI sent for you again. I know it's sort of a fib, but under the circumstances, I think you'll be all right, and it ought to satisfy your boss. As the two were about to get up from their seats, a tall, dark-haired young man in a leather windbreaker loomed over the booth. Hello there, Joey. His brown face smiled at Vicki. Hello, he said. Joey jumped to his feet. Hi, Steve. Miss Vicki, this is Steve Miller, the pilot I was telling you about the other day. Hello, Steve, Vicki returned the smile. Do you think you can make a pilot out of this fellow? I think so, or at least give him an A for eagerness. But you've got to admit that I took over the controls for a while yesterday, Joey beamed. That's right, almost flipped us over on our back. You're a pilot, Miss Barr. Oh, Joey told me all about you. So you tell him that you've got to learn to fly level before you can do nip-ups and bells, just as you have to learn to sit on a horse while he's walking before you can keep your seat when he's going at a gallop. That's true, Joey, Vicki smiled. You do exactly what Mr. Miller tells you, and we'll pin a pair of wings on you yet. It's been a pleasure, Miss Barr, Steve Miller said, and as he said as he turned to go, maybe some afternoon when we're both free you'd like to take my ship up for a spin. Thanks, awfully. I might just take you up on that one of these days. She turned to Joey. Now you do what I suggested before you go back to work. Sure thing, Miss Vicki, Joey said. Vicki came downstairs late on Monday morning, Vicki came down late on Monday morning, except for Mrs. Tucker puttering around somewhere back in the kitchen area. The big curtain house was quiet as church. At the sound of Vicky's footsteps on the stairs, the housekeeper popped her head out of the dining room door. Morning, Miss Vicki. I have some breakfast on the table for you in a jiffy. You don't want to miss the big going-ons downtown this morning. This is the day of the pirates' land. Vicki sat down at the big dining table, and Mrs. Tucker brought her a glass of orange juice. You can't live in Florida without having orange juice for breakfast, she remarked, and the girls left you this note. Vicki opened it and read, Dear Vic, had some errands to do, so Nina and I have gone on ahead. Wanted to let you get your beauty sleep. Don't miss the big pirate invasion. The ship comes in at about noon. I'll manage to find you in the crowds, I hope. Love, Louise. Vicki looked at her watch. 10:30. She'd have plenty of time. She ate breakfast and read the morning paper. It was devoted almost entirely to the coming visit of the Jose Gasparilla and the pirate crew that was expected to land and conquer the city shortly after noon. Headlines in the New York paper yesterday had been devoted to the United States' new satellite. Here, a small story about it was almost lost at the bottom of the page. One. Vicki giggled. This week Tampa turned back the clock and the calendar 150 years. There was one story on an inside page that caught her eye. It was the follow-up on the theft of the gold coins. The carefully worded account contained no new facts, simply stated that the local police and FBI were pressing their investigation, and that Mr. John Quayle, chief of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the Tampa district, was confident that the case would be broken soon. There was no mention of Joy Watson or the flashlight clue. The part of the story that most interested Vicki was the spread of pictures of antique coins that had been forwarded from the museum in New York. Even in the black and white newspaper reproduction, she could see that these were the coins of exotic design and extraordinary beauty. One showed a huge bird in flight, another a boar likeness of a sea nymph, her hair blowing above the waves. A third showed the profile of a forgotten queen wearing a tall, many-pointed crown. Her face was encircled by laurel branches. An entire coin was rimmed with stars. On a hunch, Vicki tore the picture out of the paper and slipped it into her purse. When Mrs. Tucker came in to clear the table, Vicki asked, "Aren't you going downtown to see the fun?" The housekeeper smiled in a motherly smile. "I haven't missed one yet." Outside, the sun was shining down out of a cloudless and brilliantly blue sky. A gentle breeze blew in from the Gulf of Mexico, ruffling the fronds of the tall palm trees that lined the street and serving to make the heat bearable. As she approached the downtown part of Tampa, the traffic grew heavier and the crowds thicker until by the time she had made her way to the waterfront, the throng was so jammed that she could hardly push her way through. Golly, Vicki thought, she'd never seen so many people in one place in all her life, not even in New York. The paper had said that more than 500,000 people were expected to jam the streets today, and Vicki estimated that that figure wouldn't be far wrong. This was more than 4 times the normal population of the city. She wondered how all of them had managed to find places to stay. She elbowed her way to the front of the crowd just in time to see a big drawbridge swing up to allow a big sailing ship to enter the upper bay. It was an authentic-looking pirate ship, a full-rigged sailing vessel. Hundreds of colorful pendants flew from lines rigged over its superstructure, and its decks and yard arms were jammed with men in fierce-looking pirate costumes, waving cutlasses and shooting pistols into the air. The ship's sails were furled, and a pair of tugboats, tiny by comparison, were pushing the ship through the water. Dozens of cruisers, sailboats, outboards, and skiffs were clustered around her, like chicks around a mother hen. Everybody was shouting and yelling. People in the crowd that milled around Vicki were craning their heads to see over the people. People in the crowds that milled around Vicki were craning their heads to see over the people's heads, and the fathers were holding little children on shoulders to let them see the fun. Peddlers circulated the crowd carrying trays of souvenirs, pirate flags, Confederate flags, tiny brass figures of pirates, pistols, cutlasses, and model ships. Caught up helplessly in the surging throng, Vicki was pushed this way and that, but she found that she was cheering and shouting with the rest of them and having a time of her life. Then the pirates landed, amid wild choruses of cheering and yelling and firing of blank pistols shots. The costume members of the Mystic crew clambered onto the gaily decorated floats amid the strident music of half a dozen bands. The parade began to move slowly up the street from the docks. On one of the floats, wearing a huge black beard and an eye patch and brandishing a revolver in the air, Vicki saw a figure that looked vaguely familiar. She blinked and stared a second time. It was Mr. Curtin. He wore a striped red and white sash around his waist, and on his head was perched a tri-cornered hat with a huge skull and crossbones painted on its front. Carried along by the tide of the crowd, Vicki waved frantically and yelled at the top of her voice, "Hi, Mr. Curtin. Hi, Mr. Curtin." Finally, he saw her and waved back, "Yo-ho, Vicki, and a bottle of rum. Where are all the girls?" "I don't know," Vicki shouted, but by this time the crowd had swept her away, In an instant she lost sight of Mr. Curtin and his float. The whole city was enjoying itself. When she finally wormed her way out of the middle of the huge throng, Vicki could see couples dancing in the streets under the waving palms to the music of the bands. Children were running around everywhere, carrying balloons and little toy models of ships and pirate swords. Over at the wharf, now securely tied up and deserted by its crew, the Jose Gasparilla, its pendants flapping in the gentle breeze, rocked to the motion of the water and squeaked as its sides rubbed against the rubber tire fenders that lined the dock. Free at last from the thickest part of the crowd of swarming people, Vicki stopped to catch her breath. There wasn't a chance in a million, she thought, that she would find Nina and Louise. Well, it was a pleasant day, so why not walk around and see the sights? She hadn't had a chance to do much sightseeing since she had been in Tampa. At that moment her eye was attracted to a painted sign atop. At that moment her eye was attracted to a painted sign atop one of the dockside buildings. Visit glamorous Yubar City, enchanted land of fiesta and romance. Harbor City, the Granda restaurant. The little old man on the plane had appeared to be trying to direct her attention to it. The mysterious Mr. Duke had gone there after his particular talk with Joey. She hadn't been able to rid her mind of the nagging thoughts that these two events might be connected, so why not go there and see the place for herself? She walked for some time through the crowded streets before she could find an empty taxi. Yubar City was quite different from the modern sections of Tampa. Here the streets were narrow, and ancient buildings of brick and stucco sat flush with the sidewalk. Unlike the broad, palm-lined boulevard of modern Tampa, there were few trees in evidence in Yubar City. Some of the buildings had doorways of intricate iron grillwork on some. Balconies overhung the sidewalks to make sheltered arcades. This Latin quarter of Tampa, Vicki thought, was indeed a city within a city, a bit of old Spain dropped down in the middle of a modern American metropolis. She saw signs in some of the store windows printed in Spanish, and most of the people in the streets, aside from those who wore clothes bearing marked whose clothes and bearing marked them as tourists, had dark-haired, dark-complexioned Latin look. Flags, small gold-colored ships, and other souvenirs of the Gasparilla Festival filled the window shops and were hawked by peddlers on the street. Attracted by the old world charm of the quarter, Vicki stopped the taxi and paid her fare and stepped out onto the sidewalk. She was in no hurry and decided to walk around and see the sights and visit the Granda restaurant where she came to visit it. When she came to it, she walked leisurely down the street. As she passed an old brick house with an iron grill around its doorway, she noticed the sign F.R. Eaton Smith, travel agent. Now, why was that name so familiar? Suddenly she remembered. Of course, that was the name of the man on the plane the other day. The day the gold was stolen. The man who told her he was a world traveler and lecturer and opened a travel agency in Tampa. It struck her as a little odd that he should have his office out here in the Latin Quarter instead of downtown Tampa. The windows were filled with attractive travel posters from all over the world. She halted momentarily to look at them, and at that moment a truck pulled up to the curb and stopped. The driver stepped up to Mr. Eaton Smith's door, rang the bell, while two other men wrestled a large crane out of the back of the truck and deposited it on the sidewalk. The crate was marked Air Express in large letters, and Vicki noticed casually that it was securely wrapped around with metal bands. Just then Mr. Eaton Smith answered the bell and stepped out onto the sidewalk. "Crate for you, sir," the truckman said. "Just carry it in the front hallway, boys," he said. He glanced. His glance went to Vicki, whose progress along the sidewalk had been momentarily blocked by the truckmen and their burden. As he stared at her, he looked exactly as he had on the plane, when he had given her a hand with old Mr. Tyrrell, dignified, slightly portly, slightly bald, and with his eyes scarcely visible behind the highly polished rimless glasses. He smiled and stepped up to Vicki and offered his hand. "Well, well," he said, "aren't you the little hostess from the airplane the other day?" "Hello, Mr. Eaton Smith," Vicki said, accepting his hand. "It isn't often that I run into my passengers after they have left the plane. And it's a real pleasure to see you again, Miss Barr," Vicki said. "Oh, yes, of course, Miss Barr. This is a pleasant time to visit Tampa, with the festival in full swing." He glanced over his shoulder. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Barr, I better attend to this express shipment." Nodding her head politely, she disappeared into the house. Nodding his head politely, he disappeared into the house. Vicki strode on, and turning a corner, saw a sign that read Grande Restaurant. It was on the street with the unsung Spanish name of Fifth Avenue. The Grande was a colorful restaurant, and judging by the number of people seated at the tables, a popular one. The foyer just inside the door was floored with bright mosaic tiles, as were the walls in the room. A tiny fountain in the middle of the hall was surrounded by small potted palms and brightly colored flowers. A huge archway provided the entrance to the restaurant proper. As Vicki paused under the archway and looked around the room, a dark-haired waiter wearing a short white jacket stepped up to greet her with a typical Spanish politeness. "You are meeting someone, señorita?" He spoke with a soft Spanish accent. "No, I am alone." "Then here's a nice table for you." The waiter led the way to a small table in the corner. "Will this be comfortable?" For Vicki's purpose, the corner table was perfect. Sitting here, she could view the entire room, the entrance as well. She herself was half shielded by a cluster of palms growing out of the blue and white urn. In the opposite corner of the room, a musician in the Spanish costume was softly playing Spanish tunes on an accordion. To the waiter who was standing by, she said, Do you have other musicians here, possibly at night?" She indicated the piano beside the accordionist, as the accordionist was standing as he played. "Si. At dinner we also have a piano and a violin." Vicki's heart quickened. A violin. Maybe she was on the right track after all. "Your violinist," she asked, Is he a tall, thin, elderly man with gray hair?" The waiter laughed and slapped his expansive stomach, as though Vicki had made a funny joke. "You do not know Pedro, señorita. He is big, like me, even fatter. He puts his fingers to his lips and blew kisses into the air, but his violin is the sweetest in Ubar City." "Then you don't know a violin player named Mr. Tyrrell?" The waiter wrinkled his brow and slowly shook his head. "Tyrrell?" He put a soft vowel on the end of his name. "No, señorita, only Pedro plays the violin at the Granada." Vicki's heart fell quickly as it had leaped up a moment before. To cover her disappointment, she gave her attention to the menu the waiter had handed her. She wasn't hungry, having eaten a big breakfast only a short time before, but she felt that she had to order something to justify her presence. She ordered a sandwich with an unpronounceable Spanish name. The sandwich fascinated Vicki. It contained sausage, cheese, sliced tomato, sliced olives, and capers, and it was so huge that it would have made a complete meal by itself. Along with it, the waiter brought a silver pot of coffee, which, when he poured it to a delicately made cup, proved to be as thick and sweet as hot chocolate. Vicki looked around the room as she nibbled the sandwich's ample contents. Most of the patrons were Americans, tourists in the town for the festival, she guessed, by looking at their pale, untanned faces. Scattered among them were people with distinctly Spanish faces, many of them dressed in colorful Spanish costumes. These, she knew, must be the natives of the quarter. The air was filled with a cheerful babble of conversation that was a mixture of English and Spanish. Suddenly a loud, cheerful, Spanish-accented voice made Vicki turn her head sharply. Raymond Duke was coming through the arched doorway. Arturo, he hailed at the waiter who had served Vicki lunch. ¿Cómo estás? How goes it? Bueno, Señor Duke. The waiter's dark eyes and broad smile beamed a hearty welcome. It was plain that Ramon Duke was a regular patron of the Garanda. Hello, Duke, a nearby table called. Come over and sit with us. Duke stepped briskly to their table, shook the hands all around, and sat in an empty chair. Was it hot in Havana? One of the men asked. Not on Dorado Beach, Duke flashed a white-tooth smile. A few more words, and Duke excused himself. He sat down alone at a small table with his back towards Vicki. After ordering his lunch from the ubiquitous Arturo, he took some papers out of his pocket and settled down to read them. Every minute or so as Duke was eating his lunch, various people stopped at his table to say hello. How's the Duke? That was a mighty fast trip to Havana. What's the good word, Duke? He certainly was a popular man in Ybor City. Vicki could see that plainly. Duke took his time finishing his lunch. Vicki sipped her coffee and finally ordered another pot, which she didn't want. At last Duke called for his check and paid it and got to his feet. Vicki called for her own check at the same time, and by the time Arturo had taken her money and returned her charge, and she had stepped out once again into the Fifth Avenue, she saw Duke's tall, broad-shouldered figure down the end of the block. Vicki had come to Ybor City on the off chance that she might see the little old man from the plane. Instead, she had a run-in with the mysterious Mr. Duke, the man who had offered Joy some kind of job on the afternoon before the gold robbery. Could there possibly be a connection somewhere? She didn't see how, but since she'd come this far, her detective instincts were too keen to let her stop now. She sauntered in the Duke's direction. It was well that she walked slowly. Duke was stopped half a dozen times in 2 blocks by people who loudly addressed him as the Duke and exchanged pleasantries with him. Finally, he turned into the hallway of a house, pressed the buzzer, and when it was answered, disappeared through the door. Clearly this was neither his house nor his office, or he would have gone in without ringing the bell. Vicki waited on the street for 15 minutes, looking in the window shops, trying her best to act like a tourist, but Mr. Duke did not reappear. On an impulse, she retraced her steps to the Granada restaurant. The big room was now more than half empty, settling down as do all restaurants into the mid-afternoon doldrums. Arturo, the waiter, was sitting at a table, writing out the evening menus in Spanish and purple ink on large sheets of yellow paper. He looked up as Vicki approached. Yes, senorita? It's about Mr. Duke. I have some business with him. Unfortunately, I don't have his address. I thought possibly you might help me. She took a $1 bill from her purse and placed it on the table. This is for your trouble. The waiter took her bill and slipped it into his pocket. Ah, yes, he said. But weren't you here at lunch when Mr. Duke was here? Yes, Vicki hesitated, but he was speaking to so many people. See, I understand. And you wish to know where he lives? That's right, or the address of his office. Arturo shrugged. To find the Duke is like putting your finger on Quicksilver, but his home is on Columbus Drive at the corner of 13th Street, a red brick house with a balcony. Perhaps you can find him there." Vicki inquired the way to Columbus Drive, and when the waiter told her that it was 2 streets up, she thanked him and left the cool interior of the restaurant. Walking along the street, fascinated by the colorful costumes of people by the open-air stands where white-caped chefs were serving steaming hot bowls of bean soup to any passerby that wanted one, Vicki took stock of the situation. She knew that Mr. Raymond Duke was a regular patron of the Granada restaurant, but since on Thursday she had heard him direct a taxi to take him there, this was not startling news. From the snatches of his various conversations with people in the restaurant she had overheard, she knew that he had many From the snatches of various conversations with people in the restaurant that she had overheard, she knew that he had many and varied business connections, but he had told this to Joey, so again she had learned nothing new. Old Mr. Tyrrell was not playing in the Granada Orchestra. She had leaped blindly into a conclusion that he was employed there. When she found the marked travel folder on the seat the elderly man had occupied. What she had expected to discover in Ybor City, Vicki didn't know, but what she had actually found was absolutely nothing. There really didn't seem to be much sense going to Mr. Duke's house, but since an impulse had made her inquire about this address, and since she was within a block of the house, there was no reason why she shouldn't go. When she turned the corner into Columbus Drive, she saw that it was no different from any other street in Ybor City. The same churro shops, the same restaurants, the same crowds of festival people, the same sidewalk peddlers. She found the house with no difficulty. A balcony of wrought iron grillwork overhung the front door. She stood before the house for several minutes, looking at the intricate old-fashioned grillwork over the door, peering at the heavily curtained windows which she was about to move on when the door opened and a man stepped out. It was old Mr. Tyrrell. He still looked as shabby and harassed as he had on the plane. His sparse gray hair was still badly in need of trimming. There was the same bewildered, hunted look in his eyes. When he looked up and saw Vicki, he recognized her immediately. He clasped her hand almost desperately, she thought. "Miss Barr," he whispered, "do you remember me?" "Why, certainly I do, Mr. Tyrrell," Vicki said, trying to keep her voice calm and normal in tone. The unexpected sight of this old man, who had been so much in her thoughts, had sent her heart to pounding. So there was some connection between Tyrrell and Duke and the Granada restaurant, and possibly with Duke's talk with Joey, and her imagination took a wild leap, maybe even with the stolen gold. But she said evenly, "It's nice to see you again. You look much better than you did the last time I saw you." This was a fib. If anything, the old violinist looked paler and more worried, but she felt that she had to say something to keep him here until she could put the mixed up thoughts that were spinning around crazily in her head into some order. "A few days in Florida seems to have done you a lot of good." The old man still clung to her hand. "Miss Barr, I want you. I have to talk to you." At the moment, a voice boomed from over the open doorway. "Old man, get going." Raymond Duke stood in the entryway, glowering under dark eyebrows. "Yes, sir," the old man muttered, and scurried away like a frightened rabbit. She looked at Duke. His dark frown had magically become a white-toothed smile, and he bowed his head graciously. "Ah," he said, "the young lady from the restaurant." This observation again set Vicki's heart to pounding. Had Duke seen her? The day she'd overheard his conversation in the airport snack bar, she stammered a reply. The restaurant? Ah, yes, it isn't every day a young lady lunches at the Granada alone. Raymond Duke has an eye for beauty. If you will allow me to introduce myself, and even though you sat by yourself at the corner table, believe me that I noticed and admired you. Again Vicky noticed the slight lisp in his voice as he spoke. Relieved, Vicky smiled. This was a break she certainly hadn't expected, a chance to talk with this man, who, like Mr. Tyrrell, had been so much in her thoughts these past few days. I'm flattered, Mr. Duke, she said coyly. I see, Mr. Duke said casually, that you are acquainted with our elderly friend. He nodded at the retreating figure of Mr. Tyrrell, who was hurrying down Columbus Drive, and at that instant turned a corner and disappeared from view. Not really, Vicky replied casually. I met him on the airplane coming down from New York last week. My name is Vicki Barr. I'm a stewardess on the Federal Airlines, and Mr. Tyrrell was ill. That's why I remembered him so well. Ah, so, Mr. Duke said, with a smile never leaving his dark-skinned face. Does he work for you? Vicky asked hesitantly. He told me that he was a musician, a violinist. Possibly he plays the violin, I don't know. But here in Ybor City he works as a handyman, runs errands, he shrugged. An old man can't do much to earn a living. I'm a little surprised, Vicky ventured, that in view of his circumstances he came to Florida from New York by first-class air travel. Again Duke's face darkened momentarily, but the smile reappeared almost instantly, and once more he shrugged his shoulder in the gesture that is almost as part of much a part of the Spanish language as spoken words. Quin sabe, who knows? The conversation had come to a dead end. Vicky would have liked to prolong it, but she didn't know what to say. It's been pleasant meeting you, Miss Barr, Duke said. Visit us in Ybor City again. He inclined his head in a short nodding bow. Adios. And with that, he turned and disappeared through the doorway. Vicky walked slowly down the street. At the corner, she hailed an empty taxi and directed the driver to the Curtin residence. Then she leaned back wearily in the seat and attempted to put in order the scrambled thoughts that still spun crazily in her head. She had been right after all. She couldn't imagine what the connection between Duke and old Mr. Tyrrell could be, but the old man was running errands for Duke and seemed frightened, half to death, and he had whispered desperately, I have to talk to you. Maybe she was letting her imagination run away with her, but one thing she was quite sure of, it was time to have another talk with Mr. Quayle of the FBI. She leaned forward in her seat. Driver, she said, I've changed my mind. Take me to the airport. That was chapter 7. And the plot thickens.